Maybe let me start that I'm not speaking here in any official capacity, but in a private capacity about a topic that incidentally starts roughly at the same time and place that Hart was living in a couple of decades before. It's a trip that will lead us at the same time to nowhere and to very well-known territories, all at the same time. And it builds actually on my two preceding talks about open and closed writing systems, and also about mystical writing and specific uses of writing systems for unusual purposes. This talk about fictional writing systems is at best a first word, surely not a last word on the matter. I will look at 5.5 fictional writing systems. We learn about the half at the end. And what is a fictional writing system? Is a writing system that the author, the creator of the writing system, intended for use in its fictional universe only. So it's a literary device, literary in a wide sense of the word. This excludes things like codes, such as the dancing men you know from the Holmes stories. And it also excludes exactly these type of spelling reforms, which were very much intended for real languages and real writing scenarios. The very first one, the one that was written and published right before the Reformation by Thomas More, may be the first. It's at least the first one I'm aware of. Then the world is big, and maybe you learn about others. It's part of Utopia, which of course was written not in English, but in Latin at the time. And at the same time is the first example of a utopia and of a fictional writing system. And he actually puts it very prominently next to a map, another feature that these type of publications would retain. But if you look at it more closely, it is actually a bijection on the Latin alphabet. And it's very obvious. The forms are quite different. So he goes for, by and large, symmetric letter forms, which he seems to see more perfect. But in every other aspect, this is Latin in disguise. And Latin, of course, for a humanist like Thomas More, would be the nec plus ultra of culture. So in other words, by this choice, he attributes similar type of cultures to the utopians, the citizens of the island of Utopia. Now it's a very big jump to the next specimen, and it's probably the most famous creator of fictional writing systems, Tolkien, who published together with his Lord of the Rings in the mid-50s, not one, but actually multiple writing systems. And he put an annex, I think many of you will have seen it when reading Lord of the Rings, in which he actually gives a whole history about how these developed, how these morphed over time, and became what they would later be. But his chosen people, the elves, and more particular, the most prominent of the elves, the Elder, would have created the first writing system. And interestingly, he chose a purely consonantal one. So he basically took the Hebrew model, and I think it was really specifically the Hebrew model, and transformed it and transported it to Middle-earth, his fictional universe. He even went so far to add in later adaptations to other languages, which would need vocalic writing, exactly the same mechanism that we know from Hebrew and other Semitic language, namely vowel signs. Why? Because, just like Moore incidentally, Tolkien was both an erudite and a deeply believing Catholic. And for him, this is, I'm convinced, actually a link with the chosen people of the Bible. And at the same time, Hebrew is said to be the language and with it the script used by angels. So actually it's a quite strong link that he establishes through his creation here with basically the biblical story. Now he creates other writing systems like Surth, that also originates with the elves, but was then adapted by drafts and other people of his fictional universe. And you just have to look at it, is obviously modeled on runic writing. And that one does have a full vocalic writing system with basically a phonemic writing principle. Now, one step ahead, actually not that much in time, a good decade, but it feels much longer, to another extremely famous example that was developed by Gene Roddenberry and his crew, who tried to invent, and actually did invent, a language and a writing system, but the writing system is a bit of a stepchild in this relationship for the fictional people of the Klingons, with a full dictionary that was published quite a bit later, but still in 1902, and a fully phonemic script for this very guttural language. And this, incidentally, together with Tolkien's High Valyrian, one of the Elfic languages, is something you can actually really, in real life, learn on platforms like Duolingo if you feel like it. Doesn't have terribly many users, but okay, still 300,000 people who seem to be interested in learning Klingon, or whatever practical purpose that may be. Now, these are three examples out of, I'm sure, many, and they all have in common that they are closed and that they were created by Western creators. In this case, Anglophone creators all together. It stands to reason that people growing up in an alphabetic tradition of closed writing systems would create such, according to the same model, even though Tolkien, as we've seen, goes actually quite a bit beyond that. So I'll now look at two examples picked from Eastern modern popular culture. So now we are really jumping into the very present. First with what is, I admit, one of my personal favorites, because it comes as near as possible to a grammatic novel, actually a grammatic novel for kids, as it could be. Mia Kazuki's book, which is translated into English as a sentence of a bookworm. But if we look at the original Japanese title, it's actually more something like The Book Lover's Revolution. And this is actually quite close. So here we have the book lover. And the whole idea, and this I basically borrowed with her agreement from my youngest daughter. The whole story is that a young Japanese modern woman, who's actually a librarian, with a lot of knowledge about writing about books, finds herself killed by her books, sadly, and reincarnated as a small girl in a medieval world where there are books, but books that are not accessible to the ordinary citizen. I mean, very much late medieval fantasy setting, like you have 100 of them. And actually then mine, that's the name of the heroine, the reborn heroine, reflects on this, that the writing system in this world is very similar to the English alphabet. It's not hiragana, it's not logograms, it's not kanji, well actually it's the same. It is phonographic writing. So this is very much an explicit meta-reflection in the novel itself. So why we're writing in a way. And if you look closely, you will see that she actually doesn't use 3 letters as would be the case in the katakana used in the Japanese original of the light novel, but she uses, you can see it sort of, 4 letters as you would have when you spell this in English or any other alphabetic language, alphabetic based or written in alphabetic script language. Now this is, so here we have a closer look into what she actually writes. And this is also a multi-channel type of dissemination, very typical for this type of books. It exists in a light novel, which is the version I've cited, the manga I've just shown to you, and a film, an anime in addition, and probably other forms. Now, the next one, the 5th one, is probably the most boring intellectually one, at least for me. It is a hugely successful game, Chinese game, done by a company called miHoYo that grossed in the 1.5 years of its existing ahead of $2 billion. So that's about 10 times many even successful Hollywood films take. So they're swimming in money. And as a pure anecdote, it's said that the company name was chosen because any successful IT company, it's a sort of graphematic meta joke, should have 2 O's in its name, like Google or Microsoft. Now, this game actually has multiple fictitious writing systems, with one being dominant. And it figures currently three countries, if you like. One, a sort of strange medieval version of Germany, called Mondstadt, even in its original. One, basically a game of China, and one of Japan, with more to come. And if you look here at the text, it's very much a classical alphabet. And if you look at it, what they chose is a bijection to the English alphabet, but with based on Fraktur letters, so on German style font. Otherwise, it is a really full bijection to English writing systems. Now comes the half that I promised to conclude. And for this, I would like to thank the anonymous reviewer for the tip of Arrival, which I hadn't known before. It's a film that was released in Cannes 2016, directed by Denis Villeneuve, and based on a short story from 1908 by Ted Chiang called Story of Your Life. And I'll look into both. So the main hero, and that's quite important for this story, is a linguist. So again, it's quite self-aware of what he does. And this Louise encounters together with her sidekick, a physicist, in a very set environment, aliens who have come to visit the Earth. And these aliens are symmetric. They have 7 arms or legs or whatever they are, and clearly live in a non-real, non-linear reality. Now, if we have a very short look into this, and let's see if that actually works. If not, I will skip that part. It seems to be a bit on the slow side. Yes, I'm quite. So let's skip the film, which doesn't, well, the net seems to be a bit slow. And let's have right a look at an example of this, or writing, or whatever it happens to be. And this is a circular sentence. It's actually meant to be a series of logograms, and now I use this term very consciously, that are arranged in a symmetric manner, and that then have been analyzed actually by Wolfram and others based on some 40 logograms that can be composed according to a certain grammar to build these type of sentences. Now, 40 isn't exactly much, so it's definitely very far from something that can express everything. But the basic pattern that the film imagines this to be is that you see these logograms sitting on the circular ring in a very circular world. Now, if we go to the story of your life, this is actually written by a second generation American, Ted Chiang, who is, as his name suggests, of Chinese origin, or whose family is of Chinese origin. And if you ever read it, you will understand why it won the 2000 Nebula Award for a novella. And he actually, in this story, reflects, or rather the he makes the main heroine, Louise, reflect that what the heptapods are using from outer space is a semasiographic writing system, which, to quote, conveys meaning without reference to speech. And which is, again to quote, suited for species with simultaneous modes of consciousness. Because for these species, yesterday, today, and tomorrow is all the same. It's all synchronous. Now, this as an idea is actually quite amazing, but unfortunately, is a bit the warp drive of writing systems. So I guess many of you will have heard that science fiction stories set in space have a concept of warp drives, which allows a space shuttle, a space vehicle to drive faster than light, which is a neat idea and a neat literary device, but has a slight disadvantage of being impossible. And the same is true for, at least that's my take, for these writing systems. It's a very interesting idea that forces us to reflect on what writing actually is, but it's not a writing system, not a realistic writing system, not even a realistic fictional writing system. But it is a very interesting model, for which I'm actually very thankful to have been exposed to these ideas. So let me conclude with some very initial ideas. So having looked out of at 5.5 examples out of what I'm sure 100, if we ever did a full overview of what the literature contains, if that is even possible. First of all, much in the sense of Jameson, in his Archaeologies of the Future, these writing systems mark the fictional universe as irredeemably other. Some really as irredeemably other, like in his way perhaps Tolkien, others as maybe not so irredeemably other, but as a slightly dressed up version of our current reality, but still, it gives then all observed writing systems, be they from the East or the West, are actually closed. This can be for pragmatic reasons, easier to do, but it can also be, and this is nothing more than a hypothesis, that an open writing system necessarily takes time. Necessarily takes time to evolve, to have new characters appearing over time, and thus they could at best be initiated, but never quite created in the same way as a closed writing system can. And with this, thanks for your attention.
Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
Thank you, Marc. That was a really interesting presentation. The Miho script, it has so many English characters that just look like they're upside down. I'm wondering, is it possible to take a sample of that script, turn it upside down, put it in a mirror and be able to read it? Or have you tried that?
I haven't tried that. It's quite possible. Probably I would have to start more with fracture type font. It might very well be how they came up with this. And yes, it's worth an experiment.
It's actually not fracture, it's texture. It's a bit older.
Thank you for an interesting presentation here. I was just wondering, and I'm a little bit embarrassed to say, but I haven't read the novels that you're talking about. I'm particularly embarrassed about Tolkien or not having read that. But are readers supposed to read that part of the text and make sense of it? Because that's hard work. And do they read that? Or is it just the signification of, signifying other? Because it's quite a lot of hard work they have been doing, those authors, creating a language, a different language or a new language, and then readers not reading it.
This is a very nice question. And I think it depends here on the reader. So what Tolkien wanted, and there are many references to that you can interpret if you know he is Catholic from a Catholic point of view, up to Eucharistic images in the type of food that the elves provide to the travelers. So this is very much, in my take, a reality in the novel or in the trilogy, and indeed in the whole universe that it is situated in. And the whole methodology around it is, you can read it very much, and I think from Tolkien's point of view, you should read it very much in this from this angle, but you can perfectly well read it without any such reference. And indeed, when it became very popular, it started out being very popular in hippie subculture, which definitely wasn't particularly Catholic. So you can read it if you like, in the way that Tolkien, I think, quite clearly intended, but you can read it in perfectly other ways as well.
Thank you so much for a really fun presentation. I wanted to ask you about Klingon in particular, because it seems to me, I don't know as much about the other writing systems that you're talking about, but Klingon is used. Like, there are speakers of Klingon. You can go on YouTube, you can watch a full-length opera in Klingon, you can watch music videos, you can read Shakespeare in Klingon. Like, it is a thriving community, and actual users of Klingon write with the original writing system developed by Marc Okrand and published in his dictionary of 1985. And the symbols that are that people think of when they think of Klingon were developed by the set designers for the purposes of Star Trek. And so it's a weird case where Klingon, when it's like on a T-shirt or on a mug, is rendered with this like weird looking script, but in actual practice, the writing system is, well, loosely based on, well, exactly the Latin alphabet. And I was just wondering if you might speak towards the like marketing strategies of these languages, because as you showed, most of these writing systems created for fictional purposes, with potentially the conjectural one by Ted Chiang, are very uninteresting. Like, they're just the letters converted to something that looks cool. And I wonder if you've encountered things that are a little different than that, or if you think that that in these cases, the writing system is really just all about the aesthetics.
So I see you know quite a bit about Klingon, and you have pointed out of quite a few aspects yourself. Indeed, the Klingon community, as far as it exists, and it's quite thriving, and it's probably the fictional writing system that has passed the most into reality, regardless of what the original creators wanted. And indeed, they typically use the transliteration, or what in the canon would be considered the transliteration. But the letters very much appear on starships, on other things, indeed done by the film crew. Now, why is the community using the transliteration? The community clearly precedes Unicode, and even more so the inclusion of Klingon in this context. So my first guess would be purely pragmatically, and then once it started, it hasn't stopped. I don't know if there are plans to more consistently in the community move towards the actual, like true, to whatever that might mean, writing system of the Klingons, or if they are quite happy over time also to stay in a world of transliteration. I think time will tell.
The Tolkien, if I recall correctly, has a featural aspect to it too, where it partially represents phonological features. Do you have the slide of the one the elves use? I always forget its name, but if I recall, it has a featural element where, featurally related phonemes have similar shapes. And in the world's real writing systems, that's something we see in Hangul, but not consistently elsewhere. But then we also see it in things like shorthand and so forth, coming from people who are inventing scripts, but have some phonological training, or they're thinking that way. Do you think that Tolkien was influenced by the Hangul tradition, or do you think it was just that because he was linguistically trained that he was thinking in those terms?
Okay. I can't look into his head, so I can't give you a definitive answer, but my guess would be that he was so much linguistically trained that what he actually tried to create was a perfection version of the Hebrew writing system, or something inspired by the Hebrew writing system and sharing many of its fundamental traits, without obviously being the Hebrew writing system, but perfectioning the science in the manner you've described. So by making featural aspects related, by having a much higher degree of symmetry, he definitely did have the training to do this.
And to add another piece of information, in the alphabet invented by Ursula Le Guin, besides phonographic graphemes, you also have some morphological ones indicating gender, because Ursula Le Guin was very sensitive on the gender issue. So I think every author will include elements of his or her sensibility. Thank you very much.
Thank you.